to your earlier question about Ian Rankin, I think Ian Rankin's quite a Steve aficionado. That darkness and duality, which you find in the earlier James Hogg, which is really the original Scottish doppelganger novel.
Can I ask the two, well, actually the whole panel, who do you see as your gurus when it came to crime writing? Your heroes?
It's Simenon for me.
There were, if I go back historically, obviously Christie to start with, which is where I kind of learned so much about plotting. Sarah Paretsky is important to me. Ruth Rendell was very important to me. And really, as I've gone forward, I've discovered so many writers, some of them coming after me, that I really, look up to and respect. There's a huge success of stuff out there, but also not just crime writers, other writers that have had, I would say, some influence on the way that I think and the way that I look at the novel. And this year in Scotland, we're all celebrating Muriel Spark's centenary. I've actually done an essay for Radio 3 about Muriel Spark as crime writer. There's so many of her books where people get murdered, where crimes happen, but her books are packed with crime. Nobody would ever describe Muriel Spark as a crime writer, but crime is one of the things that comes up again and again and again. Crime and punishment, good and evil, responsibility, irresponsibility, and that runs through her books. And that for me was something that has made me think about the way I write about morality.
Yeah, in that sense, Hamlet is also a crime detective fiction of sorts. Who killed the father?
What about you, Abhi?
Yes.
Oh, you mean apart from Val? Many influences. In terms of Scottish writing, a gentleman who opened my eyes is William McIlvanney, who wrote the Laidlaw trilogy, the first of which, Laidlaw, was, when I read it, I hadn't read anything quite like it. Who committed the murder on page 2. What the book is a beautiful love story to Glasgow as much as anything, and the people of Glasgow. And it was real. It was real. And Graeme was talking about being touched by a book, being spoken to by a book. In terms of crime fiction, that book spoke to me because it spoke about a place and a people that I understood. And I say understood because, as I say, I am a cultural schizophrenic. I sit between two cultures, or four cultures if you want to think about it. I can be British, I can be Scottish, I can be Bengali, or I can be Indian, depending on who I'm, setting myself against rather than being on the side of. So to me, that book really spoke to me. There have been other writers, because the part of crime fiction that really engages me is it's on the psychological spectrum, like Graeme said, which is how does a good man or a good woman uphold a corrupt system? Now that to me has always been a fascinating question. So my heroes in that sense are people like Robert Harris, who wrote Fatherland, Philip Kerr, who writes the Bernie Gunther novels, Gorky Park is one of my favourite books of all time by Martin Cruz Smith. Again, it's these good men or good people upholding a corrupt and an unjust system. How does that work? What does that do to them as individuals? And that always fascinated me. So those sorts of writers are the people that I feel, when I get one of those novels, I still like these.
One of the other things about McIlvanney, so I don't know the mic, but just very quickly, one of the other things about McIlvanney was that Laidlaw was certainly the first novel I had ever read that was written in that's the characters spoke, the way people spoke that I heard in the street. It was the first novel that actually rendered working class Scots, as it gave them a voice. And that's another issue that crime fiction I think has often addressed, in particular in the last 50 years, of giving voice to a class that doesn't normally get heard, doesn't normally get to speak.
Yeah, in my case it will be Poirot and Byomkesh. And I think Byomkesh is, if you look at that, Byomkesh is, the style of narrative there, it's kind of finding the truth. And it's the strength of the character and how the character connects with the leadership and society there. That's quite fascinating.
Byomkesh doesn't describe himself as a detective. Yes. He calls himself a Satyanveshi, truth seeker.
Right.
And to me, that's an interesting thing, because I think in the period that we're talking about, justice for Indians was a limited concept anyway. And it still is for many classes of people. Justice is something which is beyond, but truth is something different. You can get to the truth, and there's a sense of accomplishment in getting to the truth, even when you can't have justice. And to me, that word was very important. And I touched upon it in my second novel, partly as a tribute to Bonda, but partly because truth and justice are different things. And in my novels, especially when they're set, there is no justice in either of the two books I've written. The third one, there's no justice either, but there is truth. And I think we should make a distinction between the two.
An open question to all of you. I mean, did the sort of slightly senior underbelly of publishing, which is sleazier crime fiction that is published as kind of successors of penny dreadfuls, as it were. Abhijit, I'm thinking of the Schopenhauer variety of.
Coming out as omnibuses now. This book fair.
Wow.
The Schopenhauer is like.
This really
luridly
printed stuff. Oh my God, that is quite stunning. So, just wondering, I mean, do you have sort of memory of reading this stuff, which was in some ways, Val, what you were saying earlier, that something that's off-bound and there's some illicit pleasure that you draw from reading books that you shouldn't be reading.
Dirty books.
They're kind of dirty, but they're quite
they make you feel
basically
dirty.
sexy books. I mean, about so there's a touch of the night in them, but they are.
I think the really lurid end of crime writing is true crime writing, and there's a lot of, I would say, almost pornographic writing about serial killers, especially serial killers, and the market loves serial killers, and there's been some really, really good true crime books, serious books, which have examined the motives of murderers. But there's also a kind of really sort of pulpy end of it, which seems to take real pleasure in describing injuries inflicted almost invariably to women by men, and that's the sort of stuff that if you're reading it, you really feel, why am I reading this? If you're taking pleasure in reading it, what does that say about myself? And one finds it enjoyable. And the market. I used to work in a very large bookshop in Glasgow, and it stayed open till 11 o'clock at night, and there was absolutely nothing to do in the shop at that time usually. And the information desk was right in front of the crime section, and particularly the true crime section. And this is an entirely unscientific observation, but the browsers in that section were predominantly women. And it was a really interesting thing to me to wonder why women would read books describing such horrific violence in such horrific detail, and inflicted on women. So it's like what I mean, and even when you're reading quality crime fiction, what might be very bad or might not, what's going through our heads? What draws us to that? Why is crime so popular? Is there a darkness inside us?
I don't know. Maybe what draws women to the lurid true crime is the same impulse that draws women to write love letters to serial killers on death row, or any kind of killers on death row. They exist out there. There's clearly some kind of glitch in their brain that is drawn to that kind of thing. And yeah, there is fiction out there that I want to have in the house. I think you can tell very quickly the kind of writers who are almost gleeful about the pornography of violence in crime fiction, and I just don't have them in the house. There have been times when I remember picking up a Mickey Spillane novel in the 1970s, because I didn't know any better, but I was shelved under crime fiction, I knew nothing about it. I took it home, I started reading it, and I thought, this is disgusting, and I just don't want that kind of thing in my head. That's entirely different, I think, from writing directly about what violence is and what it does. In the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan books, by the nature of those books, it's necessary to be direct about what the violence is and how it contaminates every life it comes into contact with. But when I'm not writing those novels, I don't deal confrontationally with violence to nearly the same degree, because it's not required by the books. And I work very hard at writing about violence in such a way that it tells the reader what they need to know to get what they need from the book, if you like, without actually going over the top. And it's up to the reader to decide if I succeed in that aim or not. But there's definitely a strand of crime fiction in there which is frankly disgusting. And publishers, as publishers, we should be talking to about this and saying, why do you publish this stuff? Why do you put it out there? There's no need for it. There's plenty of good fiction out there. Promote the good stuff. Ditch the crap.
In fact, this played out very dramatically in the US in the 1950s when we had crime comics, which of course would have crime in very large letters and does not pay in very small letters, that kind of stuff. And there was a Senate hearing, and much of the controversy was part of the sort of McCarthyian sort of deep conservatism of 50s America, but also part of it was actually quite justified concerns about how young people were reading comics which glorified crime, and they were really, if you look at the covers, violent, misogynist, not suitable in but that sort of became a stick to beat the whole comic industry with. So that sort of was really quite a big moment in 50s America. So I suppose it don't have crime comics, do you?
But I think it was an interesting thing about the comics in America at that time, and I'm not sure, but you'll know, but was it because they kind of fell outside censorship, so films had become censored after?
Yeah, but then they started self-censorship, so you had all these if you look at comics from the 70s and 80s, you see this sort of little stamp on the top right corner, CCA, Comics Code Authority, which was one of the most conservative documents ever, where the sort of comics industry self-censored and said, we're not going to do this stuff, so kidnapping won't be glorified, or it won't be shown as to accrue profit, etc. So it also went overboard in sort of censoring itself.
I would echo that. I find it very difficult to write any sort of violence. Maybe that's the sort of Bengali Bhadralok weakling in me, but I find it very difficult. I don't see the point in writing graphic violence. I can't read it. I don't enjoy reading it. It has a place if it's part of something bigger. If you're making a point. If you're making a point around, very often it's the rape of women or it's violence towards women. If you're looking at the psychological impacts and the effect of that on families, etc., I can understand why you would have it, but violence for violence' sake, which we see too often at the more pulp end, it doesn't interest me. I write, and I think we all write, because we have a desire to get a point across, to look at a subject. If you're just writing to titillate, I get no value out of that as a writer or a reader.
Again, what's your take on this? Because you write across genres as well. So
it's very similar. In fact, I think it's all about good storytelling and creating strong characters in the novel, and it doesn't need to have that kind of vivid description of the kind of violence. Also, if you look at the Bengali society, we are not close to any kind of violence. If in terms of the society, it's more non-violent.
Well, you say that. Is that true in terms of Bengali society? I see an awful lot of violence in Bengali society, be it politics, be it in the street. But you're right. In our culture, our middle-class bourgeois Bhadralok culture, we don't discuss violence. We have a very, very, closed, cotton wool surrounded view of ourselves.
And we do live in a pretty sort of not violent probably in a criminally violent environment.
Everyday casual violence.
Casual violence on the street and aggression is pretty high.
It's not someone who has got access to guns and shooting in a school or something like that.
It's not American style violence.
Low level.
Yeah. And the other thing is that also if you look at the crime writers from Bengal, they had been also well established in the other genres. Like the two names that we took, Shatwit Ray and Sharadindra, they had been well established in other genres also. And even now the contemporary crime writers like Danish Dey, to some extent myself and others who are writing on the crime fiction side, we are known for our storytelling style, and we write across genres. So we kind of try to avoid that kind of violence, and especially when you are, for me, I write for young adults. So I have to keep that in mind, that it might have an impact on their mind, which I try to avoid, unless it is really needed for the storyline.
That is really interesting because today when Shishendra Mukherjee inaugurated the Kolkata Literary Fest, and I was just thinking that he was an author who had written across so many genres, and I still remember as a kid reading stuff like Boxer, which is essentially a kind of crime fiction, and also the creator of Shobor, which is I think one of the finest police procedurals in India, certainly.